And now our special report. The death of Peju Ugboma, an award-winning pastry chef based in Lagos, has sent shockwaves through social circles in the city. Accusations of gross negligence on the part of Premier Specialist Hospital have trailed the story. And Arise News correspondent ADEFEMI AKINSANYA reports.
Peju Ugboma had every intention of living. Her elective fibroid surgery was supposed to improve her life. Instead, it led to her death. And her family wants to know why. Here's what we know. On Thursday, April 22nd, Peju entered this hospital, Premier Specialist Medical Centre in the Victoria Island area of Lagos. The cost was 1.5 million naira, approximately $4,000. The surgery was carried out the following morning. Some 48 hours later, she was pronounced dead. Left behind are Peju's heartbroken family, which include 2 young daughters and a husband. He's distraught and unable to talk to us on camera, but has allowed us to speak to a family representative who was elected not to be identified. Amid the loss and confusion, we begin our conversation with his fondest memory of Peju.
I can't really even tell you just one fond memory, because even the day before the surgery, she was Peju. She made jokes. She was very optimistic. She had this very positive outlook. She made plans for a few days after the surgery. This was someone who was filled with so much love and always expressed it. So, yes, that's who Peju was.
Tell us, when first did you realize something was wrong?
After surgery, she complained of very acute stomach problems, but I mean, we assumed that would be a normal reaction to surgery, especially in the abdomen area, and the loss of blood pressure. So at that point, we're a bit worried. The doctors seemed to know what they were doing at the time, and we thought she would come around. Unfortunately, she didn't.
The day after the operation, Peju was losing blood. Her family say doctors at Premier told them she needed a transfusion, but they did not have her B+ blood type in their blood bank. The family was able to organise 9 pints through a crowdsourcing campaign on WhatsApp. But Peju's blood pressure had dropped as low as 50/30. Hours later, she was transferred to the intensive care unit. Thereafter, the family were asked to make another payment before she was put on a respirator.
We were in touch with a family friend who is also a consultant gynecologist abroad, and he had actually clearly stated that she must be bleeding internally, and he also insisted on speaking with the doctors, and we made sure that happened. We gave them the phone, it was on speaker. He told them in very clear terms that he's quite sure that she's bleeding internally with the information he has, and they should go back in and just stop the bleeding.
What was their response?
I mean, they said they had heard him, but it didn't seem like they acted on it.
The family say the hospital insisted a CT scan be performed before any further action was taken. Premier does not have a CT scan machine, and so the decision was made to transfer Peju to Evercare Hospital in Lekki, some 7 kilometers away.
It took 3 hours before she was moved from Premier to where the CT scan was to take place, and if there was that didn't show any urgency.
Another payment of 1 million naira was made upon arrival, and according to the family, work began to resuscitate Peju. Those efforts were in vain, and she was pronounced dead. Soon after, the family say Evercare returned around 750,000 naira to the family.
The guys at Premier left and promised to return with the death certificate. They did after about an hour and a half or so, and one of them had actually mentioned that Premier would like to carry out an autopsy. We later decided that an independent autopsy should be done. We put the independent pathologist in touch with a doctor at Premier, and he had demanded for the case note, photocopies of the case note, and the autopsy had been fixed for a particular day. Unfortunately, he called again and said Premier is yet to send him, the case note. I called the doctor at Premier and asked why, and he promised that it would be sent at a certain time. I waited and I called at that time he promised, and he said that they were still working on it. And I think he said something about having to make photocopies, and I was wondering, how long will it take? This has been almost a day to make photocopies. I'm confused. And I said, if photocopies are the problem, I can assist. When I called again, he still said the same thing. So at that point, we decided to drive to the hospital to find out what the problem was. The doctor at that point, now seeing us, said it wasn't really his own responsibility, but this was the same doctor who had promised the day before. It wasn't something we were trying to collect. We wanted them to send it to the pathologist.
It's important to note, at the time of this report, Premier Hospital has not made any public statement and insists it does not comment on individual cases. However, I spoke to staff involved in the matter, off the record, with the understanding their identity will remain confidential. Their account of events are somewhat different from that of the Ugboma family. According to this source, the delay in handing over Peju's medical records and case file was due to them seeking legal advice. Protocol dictates the request for the files from the independent pathologist must be made in writing. The hospital source says that a formal request was never made, and goes on to say another delay was due to the time it took for photocopies of each document to be made. Further, I was told the drainage system for Peju had failed, and doctors were initially unaware of the internal bleed, and when they were aware, the decision not to return Peju to the operating theatre was made due to concerns about her pre-existing health conditions.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, but I wasn't told about any, or I'm not aware of any high blood pressure being the reason why they couldn't, go back in her to stop the bleeding.
The independent autopsy was not ready at the time of this report, but the cause of death listed on Peju's death certificate issued by Premier was acute renal injury.
There are a lot of people who have lost loved ones to needless situations, situations such as this, and we just hope that it will stop, that finally people will be more responsible in carrying out their duties, especially when it has to do with people's lives.
Make no mistake, this death, much like any other in similar circumstances, is tragic and may be a byproduct of wider issues such as fake and faulty medical equipment, brain drain, and the reason why many in Nigeria still prefer to travel abroad for medical treatment. The Ugboma family say they are in touch with lawyers who are assisting them in determining whether Peju's death was as a result of negligence. Premier Specialist Medical Centre has received stellar reviews across the 30 years it's been in operation. In that time, though, mortality is inevitable. But the question is, was this death preventable? Many await the answer. ADEFEMI AKINSANYA, Arise News, Lagos.
Well, our hearts goes out to the family at this time. And joining us to discuss in more detail this special report on the death of Peju Ugboma is Arise correspondent ADEFEMI AKINSANYA herself. Hi, good to see you. I wish it was in happier circumstances. I mean, this death is so painful for what has been described as such a routine surgery, as taking out a fibroid. But in doing this story, what were you able to unearth You said at the end there that the hospital has refused to give an official statement. That's about some hours ago, 24 hours ago.
Yes.
Has that changed?
It has not changed as yet. And I think that in situations like this, you can understand why a hospital would want to be careful and cautious about any type of public statements. First and foremost, hospitals naturally aren't in the habit of talking about individual cases, no matter how popular or infamous. And so for that reason, I can definitely understand that in the interest of data protection, I'd imagine that there is some sort of effort to reach out to the family first and perhaps notify them of their intention of going public. But as it stands, yet, as far as we're aware, that hasn't changed. So what we have now in terms of a response from the hospital itself or the medical center are these off-the-record comments that I was privy to.
And then you were in touch with the family yourself directly,
Yes.
even though they didn't want to, the husband didn't want to feature.
Yes.
But the spokesperson seemed to suggest that they were thinking of taking it to court.
Yes.
Do you know definitely if they're planning to do that?
I think I don't know definitely. What I do know at this point, what they want is answers. And I think naturally when you're in the grieving process, you can only imagine the turmoil you're going through. There's naturally a lot of confusion. As you both already acknowledged, this is supposed to be a very routine operation. It's something that takes 30 minutes usually, and very common amongst black women. So they definitely weren't anticipating being in this situation. So I do think that, especially because of the type of experience they had following Peju's, untimely demise, how they felt that, the medical center weren't as forthcoming with medical documents and general treatment in the hours after her initial complaint of pain after the operation on Friday, and then in the 48 hours which led to her death. So what I do know is that they are in contact with lawyers, and that first and foremost is just to determine the actual cause of death. As it stands now, Premier were the ones who have issued the only death certificate to hand, and they list the cause of death as acute renal bleed, which is none of us here are medical professionals, but something to do with the lower abdomen area and a lot of bleeding. What is very sad about this situation is that when something like this happens, you feel a sense of solace from medical professionals because ultimately, you're trusting them with your life or the life of your loved one, and you like to think that because of their training and their intelligence, they know better than you. So you can imagine how the family feel that, perhaps this death could have been avoided. And perhaps if you took my wife's pain seriously, you might have realized that something was wrong. Perhaps if you had listened to the third-party doctor who said, I believe that there is an internal bleed, I do suggest that you go back into theatre and see what the situation there is. So it is very, very sad. And I think in hindsight is always 2020. Yeah. And we can always look back at things and think, perhaps I could have done this better. But the stakes are so much higher when it comes to life and medicine and treatment, most especially in private hospitals. So it's very difficult. As you said, this shouldn't lead to a death, but we know that risks are associated with any type of invasive procedure. Even though this was elective, she walked in to the hospital herself and was planning on, coming right back home to her family, which obviously hasn't happened. But, in terms of trying my best to deliver the plight of the family while also not open fire on this medical center, because I haven't been able to speak to anybody on the record. I haven't been able to look at these documents. We just tried our best to give the facts as they were. One thing that was very interesting, though, is that when Peju Ugboma did arrive at Evercare Hospital, which is not the hospital where she was supposed to have the procedure, it is believed that she was already unconscious, and rather than them trying to make any attempts to go for that CT scan, which they weren't able to do at Premier, or perhaps open her up for surgery to see what the situation with the internal bleeding is, their first and foremost action was to try and resuscitate her. They could not find any pulse. So that is also sad, and I can imagine that the family want more answers to do with that. Also, you had the family friends say, in between the decision to move her from Premier Healthcare in Victoria Island to Evercare Hospital in Lekki, it took 3 hours, and it's a 7-kilometer journey, something that you can take in around 11 minutes. So obviously there's lots of questions surrounding why that took so long, whether or not she was conscious on the way there, and why it was that Evercare could only work to resuscitate her on sadly in vain, but it is a terrible story all around.
And still a lot of questions and a lot to unravel as the days goes by. But something you just mentioned, and I wanted to ask because you have been covering the healthcare system in Nigeria lately with the COVID-19 pandemic situation. What is the common denominator we're seeing here? I mean, for that journey that took 3 hours for the CT scan, what's the story of the Nigerian healthcare system generally that you have seen so far?
I think what it could be is a level of uncertainty. And I think even outside of the medical space, perhaps our society in this country leads us to not want to take responsibility and shield ourselves from blame. And because of that, you have situations where sometimes the final decision isn't made. It's always about referring to another person or a senior person, which should, on its face isn't a bad thing, but in situations of life or death, you'd like to think that things are a bit more cut and dry. And throughout the coverage of the healthcare space, especially since the onset of COVID-19, one thing that we know, especially here in Lagos, as it pertains to Lagos state government, is that they've tried to improve the landscape of medical infrastructure in public hospitals and in private hospitals. So naturally, with this happening at Premier, which is not a new hospital, it's been around for around 30 years. It's a disappointing situation, but we know that deaths in hospital are inevitable. But the question is, did negligence play a role in this? Was there any type of misconduct that played a role in this woman's death? As journalists, we don't have those answers, but we will be following the story as long as they would like us to. As journalists, we do want to continue to get to the bottom of this because it is a story of national need, but I think that it is a very disappointing time for the entire medical landscape in Nigeria. The fact that Nigeria has such high levels of medical tourism when, pre-COVID, you can understand why. If somebody has the means, they naturally just want to go out because they have been known to associate Nigeria with less quality, which isn't always the truth and isn't always accurate, but that's the state of affairs. So we have to get to a point where our medical infrastructure across this country is standard.
Yes, and strangely enough, your investigation will help hopefully reassure people if we can hold people accountable for acts like negligence. Thank you so much for bringing us that report.